James Harper was a man of the soil, his hands calloused from years of working under the sun. He lived in a small southern town where fields stretched as far as the eye could see, and life moved at its own unhurried pace. But for James, this quiet existence wasn't without challenges. As a black farmer in the mid-20th century, he faced obstacles that went beyond weather or crop prices. Yet despite everything, James carried himself with an unshakable dignity. His neighbors often remarked on how hard-working and kind-hearted he was, a man who never complained, no matter how tough things got. James had inherited his farm from his father, who had worked tirelessly to buy the land when opportunities for black families were scarce. The farm wasn't large, but it was enough to sustain James and his 12-year-old daughter, Clara. She was his pride and joy, a bright girl with a curious mind and a smile that could light up even the darkest days. Clara loved spending time outdoors, with her dad, helping him plant seeds, feed the animals, and harvest crops. To her, James wasn't just a father, he was a hero. He taught her not only about farming, but also about standing tall in the face of adversity. Life wasn't easy for James and Clara. They lived in a community where racial prejudice lingered like a shadow over every interaction. At the local co-op, where farmers sold their goods, James noticed something troubling. White farmers seemed to get better prices for their produce, while black farmers like him were paid less, even when their crops were of equal quality. This unfairness gnawed at him, but James didn't want to make waves. He tried to focus on what mattered most, taking care of his family and keeping his farm running smoothly. Clara admired her father's patience, though sometimes she wished he'd fight back harder against the injustices they faced. "Why don't you say something, Daddy?" she once asked after hearing him mutter about the low payment he received for a bale of cotton. James knelt down to look her in the eyes. "Sometimes, baby girl," he said gently, "it's smarter to pick your battles. But that doesn't mean we let them win." Still, James couldn't stay silent forever. One day, he decided to speak up at the co-op meeting. He presented receipts and records showing the price disparities between white and black farmers. First, some people listened politely, nodding along. But then came resistance. A few farmers dismissed his claims, saying he must have made a mistake. Others avoided eye contact altogether, unwilling to acknowledge the truth staring them in the face. It was clear that change wouldn't come easily. Despite the pushback, James felt a spark of hope. For the first time, he realized he wasn't alone. Other black farmers began sharing similar stories, and together, they vowed to keep pushing for fairness. Little did James know, however, that speaking out would bring consequences far greater than he imagined. Back home, Clara sensed her father's growing tension. She didn't fully understand why, but she promised herself she'd stand by him no matter what happened next. The stage was set for a confrontation, one that would test James's strength, Clara's courage, and the entire community's conscience. What neither of them knew was that this moment would become a turning point, not just for their family, but for everyone around them. The day started like any other for James Harper and his daughter Clara. The sun rose early over the fields, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. After finishing their morning chores, James loaded crates of freshly harvested corn and tomatoes into the back of his old pickup truck. "Ready to go, baby girl?" he asked, glancing at Clara, who was already climbing into the passenger seat, with excitement. Trips to town were rare treats for her, a chance to see people outside the farm and maybe even grab a candy bar if they had a little extra money. As they drove down the dusty road toward the co-op, Clara chattered happily about school and her dreams of becoming a teacher one day. James listened intently, smiling at her enthusiasm. Despite the weight of the world on his shoulders, moments like these reminded him why he worked so hard, to give Clara a future full of possibilities. But as they approached the co-op, James's expression grew serious. He knew today wouldn't be easy. He planned to address the pricing issue again, hoping someone would finally listen. When they arrived, the co-op buzzed with activity. Farmers unloaded trucks, haggled over prices, and exchanged news about the latest harvests. James parked near the entrance and helped Clara climb out of the truck before heading inside to drop off his produce. As usual, the manager greeted him with a curt nod but didn't offer much conversation. When James received his payment slip, he frowned. The amount written there was far lower than what white farmers nearby were getting for the same crops. "Hold on a minute," James said firmly, stepping up to the counter. "This can't be right. I brought the same quality corn as everyone else, but my payout is less than half." The manager shrugged dismissively. "That's the price we're offering today," he replied, avoiding eye contact. "Take it or leave it." James felt his frustration boiling over. "No, this isn't fair. You've been doing this for months, paying us less because of our skin color. I have records showing exactly what others are paid. This has to stop." His voice carried across the room, drawing attention from nearby farmers. Some looked uncomfortable, shifting awkwardly in their boots. Others turned away, pretending not to hear. The tension escalated when the manager snapped back. "Don't cause trouble here, Harper. We don't need your kind stirring things up." Clara stood quietly by her father's side, clutching his hand tightly. She could feel the anger radiating off him, but also saw the determination in his eyes. He wasn't backing down, not this time. Just then, the door swung open, and Sheriff Grady Coleman strode in. A tall man with a stern face and a reputation for cruelty, the sheriff wasted no time asserting his authority. "What's going on here?" he barked, glaring at James. The manager quickly filled him in, exaggerating the situation to paint James as a troublemaker. "He's disrupting business," the manager added, sneering slightly. Sheriff Coleman narrowed his eyes at James. "You causing problems again, Harper? Can't you just take what you're given and move along?" James took a deep breath, trying to keep his composure. "Sheriff, all I'm asking for is fairness. Look at these numbers. They speak for themselves. Why should my daughter grow up thinking it's okay to be treated like this?" But the sheriff wasn't interested in listening. His patience wore thin as James continued explaining. Finally, he snapped. "Enough!" he shouted, slamming his fist on the counter. "You're coming with me." Before anyone could react, he grabbed James roughly by the arm, twisting it behind his back. Clara gasped, tears welling up in her eyes as she watched her father struggle against the sheriff's grip. "Let him go," Clara cried, tugging at the sheriff's sleeve. But he shoved her aside without a second glance. The crowd that had gathered fell silent, frozen in shock or fear. No one dared intervene as Sheriff Coleman dragged James outside, ignoring his protests and Clara's desperate pleas. The peaceful morning had turned into a nightmare, one that neither James nor Clara would ever forget. Outside the co-op, the bright morning sun seemed to mock the grim scene unfolding before Clara's tear-filled eyes. Sheriff Coleman tightened his grip on James's arm, twisting it painfully as he shoved him toward the patrol car parked nearby. James stumbled but managed to stay upright, his face a mix of anger and disbelief. "You have no right to do this," he shouted, his voice firm despite the fear creeping into his heart. But Sheriff Coleman wasn't listening. His jaw was clenched, his movements deliberate and cruel, as if he wanted everyone watching to know who held the power. Clara ran after them, her small frame trembling with emotion. "Please don't hurt him," she begged, tugging at the sheriff's sleeve again. This time, he didn't just push her aside. He yanked his arm free and glared down at her with cold, unfeeling eyes. "Stay out of this, girl," he growled, his tone sharp enough to make Clara flinch. She froze in place, her hands clutching the hem of her dress, tears streaming down her cheeks. For a moment, all she could hear was the sound of her own ragged breathing and the muffled protests of her father. James tried to reason with the sheriff one last time. "I haven't done anything wrong. You're making a mistake." But his words only seemed to fuel Coleman's rage. With a vicious shove, the sheriff forced James to his knees on the hard gravel. The impact sent a jolt of pain through James's body, but he bit back a cry, refusing to give Coleman the satisfaction of seeing him break. Clara watched helplessly, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. "Daddy!" she screamed, her voice breaking as she took a step forward. "Don't move, Clara," James called out, his tone both commanding and protective. He didn't want her getting hurt, or worse, dragged into this nightmare alongside him. But it was too late. The damage was already being done. Clara stood frozen, her wide eyes locked onto the horrifying sight of her father being beaten by the man who was supposed to protect their community. Sheriff Coleman pulled out his baton and struck James across the back, sending shockwaves of pain coursing through his body. Each blow landed with sickening precision, leaving bruises that would take weeks to heal, if they ever fully did. The crowd that had gathered earlier began to disperse, some turning away in shame, others whispering among themselves. No one dared to intervene. Fear hung thick in the air, a suffocating weight that pressed down on everyone present, including Clara. Her legs felt weak, her vision blurred by tears, but she refused to look away. She couldn't. This was her father, the man who had always been her rock, now reduced to a victim of unchecked cruelty. Every strike of the baton felt like a direct attack on her soul. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sheriff Coleman stopped. Breathing heavily, he grabbed James by the collar and hauled him to his feet. James swayed slightly, his body battered but his spirit unbroken. "You'll regret this," James said through gritted teeth, his voice low but laced with conviction. Coleman sneered in response, shoving James into the back seat of the patrol car. The door slammed shut with a deafening thud, sealing James inside like a prisoner in his own town. Clara rushed to the car window, pressing her palms against the glass. "Daddy, I'm so scared," she sobbed, her voice barely audible over the chaos swirling around them. James reached out weakly, his fingers brushing against hers through the narrow gap in the window. "Be strong, baby girl," he whispered, his eyes filled with love and determination. "We'll get through this, together." As the patrol car roared to life and sped away, Clara collapsed onto the ground, her cries echoing in the empty space, where her father had just stood. The world felt impossibly heavy, the injustice unbearable. Yet deep within her, something stirred. A spark of defiance born from the ashes of despair. She didn't know how, but she vowed to fight for her father, even if it meant standing alone. The hours that followed James's arrest felt like an eternity for Clara. She sat on the wooden porch of their farmhouse, hugging her knees to her chest as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional chirping of crickets and the distant barking of a neighbor's dog. Her mind replayed the events of the day over and over, the sheriff's cruel hands, her father's pained face, the sound of his voice telling her to be strong. Each memory cut deeper than the last, leaving her heart heavy with fear and anger. But Clara wasn't one to give in to despair. Even at 12 years old, she had inherited her father's resilience. After wiping away her tears, she made a decision. She wouldn't let this injustice go unanswered. With trembling hands, she picked up the phone inside the house and dialed the number of Mrs. Thompson, a kind elderly woman who lived down the road and often helped James with paperwork. Mrs. Thompson had always been a source of support for their family, and Clara knew she could trust her. "Mrs. Thompson," Clara said when the woman answered, her voice shaky but determined. "They took Daddy, the sheriff. He hurt him, and now he's in jail." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Oh, sweetheart," Mrs. Thompson replied, her tone soft but urgent. "Stay right there. I'm coming over." Within minutes, Mrs. Thompson arrived, carrying a basket of food and a notebook filled with contacts she'd gathered over the years. She knelt beside Clara, wrapping her arms around the girl in a comforting embrace. "We'll figure this out together," she assured her. "Your daddy's going to need us to stay strong." The next morning, armed with Mrs. Thompson's guidance, Clara visited her father in the county jail. The sight of him behind bars broke her heart all over again. His face was bruised, his usual confident posture replaced by exhaustion. But when he saw Clara, a faint smile crossed his lips. "Hey, baby girl," he said softly, reaching through the bars to hold her hand. "I told you to be brave, didn't I?" "I am being brave," Clara replied, trying to sound tougher than she felt. "And we're going to fix this, Daddy." Mrs. Thompson is helping me find someone, a lawyer, to make them let you go. James nodded, pride shining in his weary eyes. That's my girl, he said, squeezing her hand gently. But listen carefully, Clara. This fight isn't just about me. It's about standing up for what's right for all of us. Don't forget that. Back home, Mrs. Thompson introduced Clara to Mr. Benjamin Hayes, a young civil rights lawyer from the city who had recently moved to the area. He agreed to take James's case pro bono after hearing the details. This is exactly the kind of abuse we've been fighting against, Mr. Hayes explained during their first meeting. Sheriff Coleman won't get away with this, not if we have anything to say about it. As the days passed, Clara threw herself into helping gather evidence. She accompanied Mrs. Thompson to speak with neighbors, many of whom admitted they'd seen similar injustices but had been too afraid to act. Slowly, a network of supporters began to form, united by the belief that James's ordeal couldn't be ignored. Together, they collected documents proving the unfair pricing at the co-op, eyewitness accounts of the arrest, and even old records of complaints filed against Sheriff Coleman. Despite the growing hope, the weight of the situation still pressed heavily on Clara. Nights were the hardest. Lying in bed, she stared at the ceiling, wondering if justice would truly prevail. What if no one believed them? What if the sheriff got away with everything? These questions haunted her, but each time doubt crept in, she reminded herself of her father's words. Stay strong. One evening, as Clara sorted through papers at the kitchen table, Mrs. Thompson placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You're doing amazing work, child, she said warmly. Your daddy would be proud, and so am I. Clara smiled faintly, though her eyes remained serious. I just want him to come home, she whispered. And he will, Mrs. Thompson promised. But remember, this isn't just about bringing your father back. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what you two are facing. That's how change happens, step by step. Clara nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Though the road ahead seemed uncertain, she knew one thing for sure. Giving up wasn't an option. Not for her father, not for herself, and not for the countless others counting on them to shine a light in the darkness. The story of James Harper's arrest spread like wildfire, fueled by Clara's determination and the growing network of supporters rallying around their cause. What started as whispers among neighbors soon turned into headlines in newspapers across the state. Journalists descended on the small southern town, eager to uncover the truth behind the brutal treatment of a hardworking farmer and the systemic injustices plaguing the community. For Clara, this newfound attention was both overwhelming and empowering. She saw it as a chance to amplify her father's voice and shine a light on issues that had long been swept under the rug. One afternoon, while sitting on the porch with Mrs. Thompson, Clara watched as a young reporter named Sarah Jenkins approached their home. Sarah carried a notebook and camera, her expression warm but professional. Miss Harper? She asked gently, addressing Clara. I'd like to hear your side of the story, if you're comfortable sharing. Clara hesitated for a moment, glancing at Mrs. Thompson for reassurance. The older woman gave her an encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, Clara invited Sarah to sit down. As they talked, Clara recounted everything. The discrimination at the co-op, the sheriff's violent actions, and her father's unwavering resolve even in the face of such cruelty. Her words were raw and heartfelt, painting a vivid picture of a family torn apart by prejudice. When Sarah snapped photos of Clara standing beside her father's empty fields, the images captured not just loss but also resilience, a symbol of hope rising from struggle. Sarah's article appeared in a major newspaper the following week, accompanied by a striking photograph of Clara holding one of her father's tools. The headline read, "A daughter fights for justice after sheriff's brutal arrest of black farmer." Readers were moved by the story, flooding the paper's office with letters of support and calls for accountability. Donations poured in from strangers who wanted to help James rebuild his farm once he was released. Civil rights organizations reached out, offering resources and legal aid to strengthen their case against Sheriff Coleman. Inspired by the momentum, Clara decided to step further into the spotlight. With Mr. Hayes's guidance, she began attending local marches and rallies organized by civil rights activists. At first, speaking in front of crowds terrified her, but each time she stood before a microphone gripping its stand tightly, she reminded herself of her father's courage. "My daddy taught me to stand tall," she told the audience during her first speech. "He showed me that we can't let fear silence us, not when there's so much at stake." Her bravery resonated deeply with others, especially young people, who saw themselves in her story. Teenagers began showing up at rallies holding signs that read, "Justice for James Harper" and "Fairness for all farmers." Teachers incorporated Clara's story into classroom discussions about equality and activism, inspiring students to think critically about the world around them. Even some white farmers, initially hesitant to join the fight, started questioning the status quo after hearing Clara speak. They realized that fairness wasn't just a black issue, it was a human one. Back at home, Clara worked tirelessly alongside Mrs. Thompson and Mr. Hayes, organizing petitions and gathering more evidence to expose Sheriff Coleman's misconduct. Anonymous tips began surfacing, revealing years of corruption within the sheriff's department. One tip led investigators to discover falsified reports used to intimidate black residents. Another uncovered embezzlement schemes involving funds meant for community programs. Each revelation added fuel to the fire, turning public opinion firmly against Coleman. As the pressure mounted, Clara found solace in small victories. A local pastor offered to host a fundraiser for James's legal fees, drawing hundreds of attendees. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now knocked on her door, offering food, supplies, or simply a kind word. "You're making a difference, Clara," one elderly man told her after dropping off a basket of fresh vegetables. "Your daddy would be proud." Though the battle was far from over, Clara felt a renewed sense of purpose. Every march, every speech, every late-night strategy session brought them closer to justice, not just for her father, but for everyone who had suffered silently for too long. And as she stood beneath the stars one evening, gazing at the fields her father had worked so hard to cultivate, she whispered a quiet promise to herself. "We're going to win this fight, for you, Daddy." As the investigation into Sheriff Grady, Coleman deepened, cracks in his carefully constructed facade began to show. The evidence against him was mounting. Falsified reports, embezzled funds, and a long history of discriminatory practices that painted a damning picture of abuse of power. What had started as Clara's quiet fight for her father's freedom had evolved into a full-blown reckoning for the entire town. People who had once feared speaking out now felt emboldened, sharing their own stories of mistreatment under Coleman's watch. It seemed karma was finally catching up to the man who had ruled with an iron fist. One fateful morning, federal investigators arrived in town, their presence sending shockwaves through the community. They set up shop in the old courthouse, interviewing witnesses and sifting through decades of records. Clara watched from a distance as agents combed through the co-op's ledgers, uncovering glaring disparities in payments to black farmers compared to their white counterparts. Each new discovery added weight to James's case and exposed the systemic rot that had plagued the town for generations. For Clara, it was both vindication and validation, proof that her father wasn't alone in his struggle. The tipping point came when a former deputy, unable to live with his conscience any longer, stepped forward with explosive revelations. He revealed that Coleman had orchestrated not only the unfair treatment of black farmers, but also orchestrated violent crackdowns on anyone who dared challenge him. "He told us to make examples of people like James Harper," the deputy confessed, during a televised interview. "Anyone who spoke up got silenced one way or another." The confession sent ripples across the nation. News outlets picked up the story, shining a spotlight on the small southern town that had become ground zero for discussions about racial injustice and police accountability. Protesters gathered outside the sheriff's office, chanting slogans like, "No more corruption," and "Justice for James Harper." The sheer scale of outrage forced local officials to act. Within days, Coleman was suspended from duty pending further investigation, his reputation in tatters. But karma didn't stop there. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered even more skeletons in Coleman's closet. Financial audits revealed he had been siphoning money meant for community development projects, using it to fund lavish personal expenses. Photos surfaced of him vacationing on tropical islands, while residents struggled to access basic services. The final nail in his coffin came when prosecutors announced formal charges: corruption, misuse of public funds, and excessive use of force, among others. For Clara, watching Coleman's downfall unfold was surreal. She remembered the fear she'd felt standing powerless in front of him just months earlier. Now, as she saw news clips of him being escorted out of his office in handcuffs, she couldn't help but feel a sense of poetic justice. Karma, it seemed, had delivered exactly what he deserved. Yet Clara knew this victory wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who had stood up against oppression, refusing to let silence prevail. With Coleman gone, the town began to breathe easier. Local leaders scrambled to repair the damage, implementing reforms aimed at ensuring fairness and transparency. At the co-op, new policies were introduced to standardize pricing, eliminating the discriminatory practices that had plagued black farmers for years. James's lawyer, Mr. Hayes, worked tirelessly to secure compensation for those affected by the biased system, including James himself. Slowly but surely, the tide was turning. Clara visited her father in jail one last time before his release. Date. Though battered by his ordeal, James's spirit remained unbroken. Sitting across from him, Clara shared updates about the changes happening in town. "It's because of you, Daddy," she said proudly. "Because you refused to stay silent." James smiled, his eyes glistening with emotion. "And because of you, baby girl," he replied. "You've shown me and everyone else that no matter how hard things get, we can still rise above." As they embraced through the bars, both father and daughter knew their journey wasn't over. But for the first time in a long while, they allowed themselves to hope, for healing, for justice, and for a brighter future, where no one would have to endure what they had faced. Karma may have dealt its blow to Coleman, but true change would come from the courage of ordinary people choosing to stand together. When James Harper finally walked out of the county jail, it felt like a new beginning. Not just for him, but for the entire community. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the fields as Clara ran to meet him. For weeks, she had imagined this moment, seeing her father free, standing tall despite everything he'd endured. Now, as she threw her arms around him, tears streaming down her face, the weight of their struggle began to lift ever so slightly. "We did it, Daddy," she whispered, clutching him tightly. "We really did it." James held her close, his voice thick with emotion. "No, baby girl, you did it. You carried us through this." He looked older than before, his face lined with the toll of his ordeal, but there was a spark in his eyes, a quiet strength that no amount of cruelty could extinguish. Together, they climbed into the old pickup truck and drove home, where neighbors had gathered to celebrate his release. The yard was filled with lanterns strung between trees, laughter mingling with the sweet scent of barbecue wafting from the grill. It was a modest celebration, but it meant the world to James and Clara. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to normal, or at least as close to normal as it could be after such an upheaval. With the compensation awarded by the co-op's investigation, James set about rebuilding his farm. Strangers from across the country sent donations, seeds, tools, even livestock, to help replace what had been lost during his time in jail. Volunteers arrived on weekends, rolling up their sleeves to repair fences, till the soil, and plant new crops. Among them were some of the very neighbors who had once stayed silent. Their presence spoke volumes about how much the town had changed since Coleman's fall from power. Clara, too, found herself transformed by the experience. No longer just a farmer's daughter, she became a symbol of resilience and activism. Schools invited her to speak at assemblies, sharing her story with students eager to learn about standing up for justice. Teachers praised her courage, calling her a role model for young people everywhere. At first, the attention made her uncomfortable. She didn't see herself as extraordinary, but over time, she embraced it, using her platform to educate others about the importance of equality and fairness. One evening, as father and daughter sat together on the porch watching fireflies dance over the fields, James turned to Clara with a thoughtful expression. "You know, baby girl, this land means more to me now than it ever did before," he said softly. "It's not just dirt and seeds, it's a promise. A promise that no matter how hard things get, we can rebuild, and we can make sure the next generation doesn't have to fight the same battles we did. Clara nodded, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I want to keep fighting, Daddy," she replied, "not just for us, but for everyone who doesn't have a voice yet." Her words reminded James of why they had persevered through so much pain. Their fight hadn't ended with Coleman's arrest or the reforms sweeping through the town. There was still work to be done, laws to strengthen, minds to change, hearts to open. But for now, they allowed themselves to savor the small victories, the thriving crops in the fields, the kindness of strangers turned allies, and the unbreakable bond they shared. As autumn approached, bringing cooler breezes and harvest season, the Harper farm buzzed with activity once again. Neighbors stopped by to lend a hand, their laughter echoing across the fields. Children played near the barn, chasing chickens and marveling at the newborn calves. Even Mrs. Thompson joined in, supervising the baking of pies for a community potluck. The sense of unity was palpable, a testament to how far the town had come in embracing change. For James, every sunrise brought renewed gratitude for his freedom, for his daughter's unwavering love, and for the support of those who had stood beside them. Life wasn't perfect, but it was full of hope. As he watched Clara lead a group of kids through the rows of corn, teaching them how to pick ears without damaging the stalks, he realized something profound. The seeds of justice they had planted weren't just growing in the fields, they were taking root in people's hearts, and that, more than anything, gave him faith in the future. Years passed, and the small southern town that had once been defined by division and fear transformed into a place of unity and progress. The scars of the past hadn't disappeared entirely. Some wounds ran too deep to fully heal. But the community had taken significant strides toward equality and understanding. James Harper's farm became a symbol of resilience, not just for his family, but for everyone who had witnessed their fight for justice. Fields that had once stood barren now flourished with golden corn and vibrant tomatoes, a testament to hard work, perseverance, and the power of standing up against injustice. Clara grew into a remarkable young woman, her childhood experiences shaping her into a passionate advocate for civil rights. After graduating at the top of her class, she earned a scholarship to study law, determined to continue the fight her father had started. Her professors often remarked on her sharp mind and unwavering determination, qualities she inherited from James. During summer breaks, Clara returned home to help her father on the farm while mentoring local youth, teaching them about activism and the importance of using their voices for change. To many, she was proof that one person, no matter how young or seemingly powerless, could make a difference. James, now older and grayer, spent his days tending to the land he loved so dearly. Though his body ached more than it used to, his spirit remained as strong as ever. He took pride in watching Clara grow into a leader, knowing she carried forward the lessons he had taught her about courage and fairness. On quiet evenings, they would sit together on the porch, sipping lemonade, and reflecting on how far they'd come. "You've made me proud, baby girl," James often said, his voice filled with admiration. "Prouder than I ever thought possible." Meanwhile, Sheriff Grady Coleman faded into obscurity, a shadow of the man he once was. Stripped of his badge and reputation, he lived out his final years in poverty, shunned by the very people he had tried to dominate. Karma, it seemed, had delivered its verdict, leaving him isolated and forgotten. For those who remembered his cruelty, his downfall served as a stark reminder that no act of injustice goes unpunished forever. The town itself underwent a renaissance. New businesses opened, offering opportunities to Black entrepreneurs who had long been excluded. Schools implemented programs celebrating diversity, ensuring future generations understood the value of inclusion. Even the co-op became a model of fairness, hosting annual events to honor farmers like James who had fought for equality. A plaque was erected outside its doors bearing the names of those who had championed reform, a permanent reminder of the courage it took to challenge the status quo. One crisp autumn afternoon, the town gathered for a special ceremony at the Harper farm. It was a celebration of survival, resilience, and hope. Neighbors brought food, Music filled the air and laughter echoed across the fields. At the center of it all stood James and Clara, side by side, smiling as they looked out over the crowd. "This is what we fought for," James whispered to Clara. "A place where everyone can belong." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Clara took a moment to reflect. She thought about the journey they'd endured, the pain, the fear, the moments of doubt, and realized none of it had been in vain. Their story wasn't just about survival. It was about transformation, about turning hardship into hope, anger into action, and fear into courage. When the festivities ended and the last guests left, James and Clara lingered under the stars. The fields stretched endlessly before them, bathed in moonlight. "Daddy," Clara said softly, breaking the peaceful silence, "do you think karma really exists?" James chuckled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "I think karma is what happens when good people refuse to give up," he replied. "It's not some magical force, it's us, our choices, our actions, and if we keep doing right, karma will always find its way." Clara smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace. Life still held challenges, but she knew they could face anything, as long as they stood together. As they walked back toward the house, hand in hand, the fireflies danced around them, one last flicker of magic in a world they had helped transform.